4th of October, 2004. The body of a 30-year-old woman is found dead on the floor of her bedroom in North County Dublin. She's been brutally attacked.
The community will always be scarred by them. It'll always be something that is remembered about the Knoll.
My first reaction and how entering the house that day was there's a psychopath at large here.
A massive Gardaí hunt for the killer turns up no immediate answers, but in time it emerges the main suspect is hiding a dark secret.
It was a brutal killing, cruel killing, but it also signifies the anger that he had towards Rachel.
He had himself convinced that he had committed the perfect murder.
This is the story of that man and that secret. How he thought he had covered his tracks and how technology eventually led to his conviction. And why the murder he perpetrated is one of Ireland's most shocking crimes. Knoll, a rural feeder area of Dublin, located about 20 miles north of the city.
It's a very pretty area. It's in the North County Dublin, so about 25 minutes in good traffic from the centre of the city.
Certainly not a high crime area. It's a rural area. Single cottages, small houses, and I suppose really a promise of an ideal life for a young family, that they'd be living in the country but yet near to services, schools and the city centre.
The tranquility of the area made the events of October the 4th, 2004 all the more shocking. At around 1:30 that afternoon, Rose Callally discovered the battered body of her daughter, Rachel O'Reilly, on the floor of a bedroom in the house she shared with her husband Joe and their two sons, Luke and Adam, at Baldara, close to Knoll.
I just walked up into the bathroom first and I looked into the bathroom and I didn't even notice the blood then.
She went down to check the rooms and she checked the boys' room first and everything seemed okay there. And then she went to Rachel's room and immediately she opened the door. Immediately she looked in the door. She saw Rachel's body.
And I remember kneeling down beside Rachel and she was cold, stone cold. But I knew before I knelt down that she was dead.
She'd been brutally assaulted and battered about the head with a blunt object.
Rachel lay on her back. Her upper body was twisted to one side. She was wearing a pair of grey tracksuit bottoms and a grey sweatshirt. And there was quite a lot of blood staining visible.
The blood was so badly congealed that Rose said afterwards she could not tell whether she was face down or whether her head was to the side.
She appeared to have been taken completely by surprise. She received a lot of blows to the head with a heavy instrument. Her skull was fractured in two places. She also had a lot of lacerations to her body, to her neck, to her shoulders from blows, and the pathologist report indicated that she had been hit from anything from 6 to 9 times with a heavy instrument on the head.
And to my dying day, I'll never forget the sight.
As Garda investigations and house-to-house inquiries began, the attention turned to Joe O'Reilly. But Joe had a cast-iron alibi.
Joe O'Reilly had what appeared to be a bit of a copper-fast alibi. It would have seemed initially impossible that he could have made a journey back to the Knoll and back to work within the period of time.
The O'Reillys had been together for 13 years. Their romance had blossomed when they worked together.
Rachel was 17 and he was 19. They both worked in Arnott's. He was in the stores and he spotted Rachel. He told me actually that the reason that he spotted her was because she was unusually tall. She was 5'11" and he was 6'4", 6'5".
He'd asked her out a few times and she didn't go out with him, but he'll admit himself even that he kept trying.
he overheard her saying that she played softball. So he turned up at practice. He decided to join the same softball team.
They both played it successfully and almost professionally. So they had a lot in common.
They got quite serious quite quickly. He proposed to her on the top of the Eiffel Tower, and they were engaged for about 2 or 3 years, bought their first home together in Santry. It was a couple of years after that she found the home in the Knoll.
They chose the location because they felt it was the ideal place to bring up their children.
Everything she seemed to do was for her children. You know, the moving out to the Knoll, even though it was an isolated area and away from everything she knew, it was because she wanted to give her kids the kind of upbringing that she thought would be best for them.
It would be great for the children. She said it's real country-like, which it was. It was a lovely bungalow. Now, it needed an awful lot done to it. A huge big back garden to it. But I sort of felt to myself, I felt it was very lonely for her with the 2 children and him away so much and that. But she seemed so happy about it.
Rachel was one of 5 children adopted by Rose and Jim Callally. The pair had raised a very close family, and Rachel was in regular contact with her parents and her siblings.
Rachel was just such a live wire. She was into everything. Never a very good child, and never gave any trouble really at all. And whatever was to be, she was involved in everything she could.
They seem to have had almost idyllic childhood. They had taken off to Australia at one stage, the family, and spent a year together holidaying their way home to Ireland as such. She got on very well with her sister Anne, and the brothers were very protective of the 2 girls. A lovely family. And when she got married, she had the full support and encouragement of her family. Her sister was her bridesmaid. She's very popular with her friends, very bubbly. She would have made friends wherever she went.
Joe O'Reilly was also close to his family, but he'd come from different circumstances.
His parents had separated when he was young, and his father had left the family home, moved to England.
Joe was the second eldest, 2 boys and 2 girls. His dad worked for the corporation. His mum Anne cared for the family, and also the youngest daughter Martina has special needs.
They were close knit. They certainly got on, and his brother Derek would have looked up to Joe. Joe was the kind of the man of the family as such.
He had a thing in his head that people should not split up.
Joe worked as an account manager at Viacom Outdoor Advertising, based in Bluebell in Dublin. He was keen to get ahead.
Joe O'Reilly was a very, very confident man. He was a man who went to the top of the advertising game with no qualifications. He just went there because he was so impressive when he went into a room, and so persuasive in terms of making his pitches and whatever.
He wanted marriage, children and a career, and he'd gone into advertising and was very successful at it, very hard working. Would have been in very early in the morning and worked late at night, and had high ambitions to climb a ladder in life, really.
While being seen to be a good family man was important to Joe, his work commitments and his other social outlets left him little time as a father.
Rachel's friends spoke later about how they felt that Rachel was left to do a lot of the parenting by herself. They would have claimed he was absent a lot. As he told me himself, he was going to the gym before work and was often leaving the home at 6 a.m. and not returning till quite late in the evenings.
The 2 boys were very, very important to him. Whether or not he actually spent a huge amount of time with them or not is debatable, but he certainly felt that he should have been seen as a very good father.
Whatever image the couple might have projected publicly, their marriage had become an unhappy one.
She was a private person, Rich, and she didn't really speak about their marriage to many people, but friends of hers did sense that there was trouble there.
If she thought there was difficulty, she was putting it down to having 2 young children and the stresses of life, and maybe she was coming from a point of view that she'd worked through it. I think all young couples, when they have children, do go through that, and presumably if she spoke to anybody about it, they would have reassured her that it was quite normal to have difficult periods. But certainly she seemed to be still in love with Joe and didn't seem to be planning a life without him.
Joe had been secretly confiding in his sister, Anne, about their difficulties.
Joe O'Reilly spoke about their marriage problems in amazing detail, really, to his sister.
The dynamic of the relationship had changed. He was becoming more controlling, more manipulative, more bullying, and he described her as repulsive.
He was putting her down. He certainly, anyone that was willing to listen to him, he was criticising her for, particularly in relation to what he was conceived as that she wasn't looking after the children properly, that she felt she was looking after them, he felt she wasn't, and it would appear that he was trying to do the groundwork to get possession of the children.
The things he said about Rachel were they were just disgusting. He really has stuck with me, actually. Although if anything, that's it, just the language he used to describe his wife was extremely cruel. It was actually grotesque slurs, really, on her. It was horrible.
Those awful emails between one family and member and another, and how they referred to Rachel, and how they could talk about any person, even a stranger, in the manner that they spoke about. We were bereft.
But the unhappiness in his marriage was not the only secret Joe O'Reilly was hiding. And it was one which was soon to be uncovered. "30-year-old Rachel O'Reilly was brutally murdered in her own bedroom at her home in North County Dublin on the morning of October the 4th, 2004. The attack was savage and sustained, and Gardaí immediately began to try to establish a motive for what appeared to be a senseless murder.
It is abnormal for somebody to be attacked by a stranger in their own home and killed in such a way.
She was battered to death, really. There was blood all over the place, including ceiling, and it was a frenzied attack that was carried out on her.
An incident room was set up at Balbriggan Garda Station, and officers began house-to-house inquiries in the area.
There was over 40 guards involved and detectives involved in the investigation. House-to-house inquiries were carried out over a wide area.
First reports were of a burglary gone wrong.
Initially, the reports were that it had been a crime gang, that she had been attacked in her house by burglars.
Stuff in the kitchen was dishevelled, in the rooms were dishevelled, and the initial reaction when you went in was that these had been burglars searching the house. But significantly, at a very early stage, there was money found in the house which any burglar would have found.
And then, of course, there were the two large sums of money that these burglars had left behind. Over €800 in a Tupperware box in the kitchen, and over €400 was found in her handbag.
While there had been a spate of robberies in the area, they were an unlikely target. The house was an unlikely target at that time. So it would have been on the investigators' minds that, perhaps this isn't all that has been presented to them.
During interview that evening, Joe O'Reilly was able to tell detectives in some detail of his whereabouts that day.
They asked him a number of things. One was to account for his movements on that day, which he gave an account of his movements on that day. They also asked him about his relationship with Rachel, if everything was going okay, and he said it was. He indicated that it was. He indicated that there may have been ups and downs like every marriage, but he passed it off in that context, but he indicated that everything was okay. They also asked him if he, either himself or Rachel, was in any relationship with anybody outside the marriage, and his initial reaction was no, he wasn't aware that Rachel was, and he indicated that he wasn't.
It was then, in further discussion with detectives, that he admitted to something which he had denied up to that point.
And they asked him for a third time, and he finally admitted that he had in fact been having what he described as a brief relationship that wasn't very serious.
The woman in question was 34-year-old Nikki Pelly.
He named Nikki Pelly that he had been in a relationship with her for a short while.
Now, he maintained that he had lied to them because he didn't want his family and their friends and Rachel's family to find out about this relationship, because it was inconsequential really in the scheme of things.
Joe and Nikki first met when they worked together at the Viacom advertising agency.
How their relationship started initially was after a night out at the Barge pub, and they had exchanged email addresses and had struck up a bit of a flirtation, where they would swap funny jokes and things like that. And they arranged to meet.
Joe, on at least 2 nights a week, was staying in Dublin, staying with Nikki Pelly, and when questioned by Rachel as to why he was away these nights, he indicated that was work-related and that he was staying in the office rather than going home and disrupting her and the family in their sleep.
She must have suspected something, but he said he had a softball game on a Tuesday night and he'd go and stay with Nikki Pelly, and twice a week they'd meet and they spoke on the phone every day, and the relationship had obviously developed at such speed and to such an extent that he was going to leave Rachel and he was going to set up home with Nikki, but he wasn't willing to do that without his children with him.
Joe's story to Gardaí was plausible. He reiterated to them that despite the difficulties in his marriage to Rachel and the relationship with Nikki, something he played down, he was a dedicated family man.
Obviously, the Gardaí didn't suspect him at the initial stages.
At that stage, he was still very much a grieving widower.
Joe told the Gardaí that he and Rachel had argued on the evening of the 3rd of October.
The night before the murder, the two of them had had some sort of an argument, and he had slept in the spare room, which wasn't totally unusual. He got up at 5 a.m. or 5:30 and left the house to go to the gym. Again, it wasn't something that was unusual.
He was absolutely unequivocal when it came to his movements on the day of Rachel's murder. He had an alibi for the morning provided by a colleague called Derek Querney.
His alibi was that he left his home at about 5:30, went to a gym out in the Clondalkin area, met his workmate Mr. Querney there.
And they spoke about, an on-site inspection they were doing that day.
They had showers, and they then left and they drove separately to their headquarters at Bluebell Industrial Estate.
Joe arrived at 7:45. He emailed another colleague, Kieran Gallagher, to say he might not be available for most of the morning and that he would meet him for lunch at 2 o'clock.
He went in there and checked his emails. He had a cup of coffee.
Derek Querney was at his office doing work on rostering, and a few minutes after entering, Joe contacted Derek and he said, "Are you ready? We'll go down to the buses down in Broadstone." Derek wasn't complete, so he said, "You go ahead," he says, "and I'll follow you."
CCTV footage shows that Joe O'Reilly left the office at 7 minutes past 8. According to his own detail about his movements, he made the half-hour drive to the CIE depot at Broadstone in Dublin 7. Derek Querney remained at Viacom, sorting out work schedules and rosters for the crews for the day. He left the offices at around 8:45 a.m. and made his way to Broadstone.
And when he got there, he rang Joe's mobile to find out where he was, and Joe said he was down at the back in some part of the bus depot down at the back, but that he didn't actually see him there. He continued working there. And sometime later, he bumped into Joe in the yard, and they both travelled back in their own cars back to the Bluebell Industrial Estate.
And then he arrived back at the office roughly around 12 o'clock that day.
At 1:15 p.m, Joe O'Reilly received a call from Tots United Crash. Rachel hadn't collected their 2-year-old son, Adam, at 12:30 as usual. Joe then made a series of phone calls on his mobile. He rang Rachel.
Hiya, Rach. It's only me. I just got a call from Helen in Montessori. She says you haven't picked up Adam. Was Sarah meant to pick him up or something? Give us a shout, will you?
This was followed by another call at 1:24.
Rach, this is Joe. I tried your number now. I don't know how many times. You're not in Jackie's, you're not in your mother's. I'm now really, really, really worried about you. Please call me, please call. It isn't funny. This isn't like you.
And then, having called Rachel's family to tell them of his concerns, he made another, final call.
Rach, it's me again. I'm just on the M50. I've spoken to your mother. She's going to pop on out. Please ring. I've been crying. You have me worried. I don't know. Please talk to me, please.
By 2 p.m., Rose Callally had already made the discovery of Rachel's body. The scene was gruesome in the extreme.
I could see that there was bloodstaining present on the wall and floor around the doorway into one of those bedrooms. And I could also see the body of Rachel. From the bloodstain patterns, it was possible for me to say where the assault had occurred on Rachel, which was close to her bedroom door and where she now lay. And it was possible to say that she was violently beaten over a period of time.
Joe O'Reilly arrived at his home at around 2:30 to be met by his mother-in-law.
He had one of the children with him that he was after collecting from school, and the other had been collected by a friend of Rachel's. And he arrived at the house, and when he arrived, he appeared to have not a care in the world. He was in great form, and Rose Callally told him that Rachel was dead inside in the house, that she appeared to have been murdered.
I had said to him before we got up the steps, I think Rachel has been murdered. I said, Rachel is dead, Joe, and I think she's been murdered. I think that's what I said to him.
He immediately ran in and he went down over Rachel's body to test the pulse, and his initial reaction was to say to Rachel, "What have you done, Rachel?"
I was waiting on him to get down on his knees and take Rachel in his arms. I was puzzled from then on. I really started to get, he was maybe not the murderer, I didn't think, but there's something odd here and this is not right.
When the first guard arrived at the house, Joe approached him in the back garden and he said to him, "I've been in the house," he said, "I've gone down over Rachel's body to test for a pulse and that." He said, "I also moved a box of books which was near her body. I hope I haven't destroyed the scene on you. I'm sorry." He said, "I hope I haven't destroyed the scene on you."
Gardaí were suitably respectful at the distraught, bereaved husband. But from an early point in the investigation, suspicions were beginning to be formed about the veracity of Joe O'Reilly's story. But it was technology which would really give the game away. As Gardaí attempted to establish a motive for the brutal murder of 30-year-old Rachel O'Reilly in North County Dublin on the morning of October the 4th, 2004, her husband, Joe, appeared to have a cast-iron alibi.
Derek Kearney was Joe's friend and he was his alibi. They had met that morning in the gym. They'd had a sauna or steam together and they'd gone to work together and they had gone to the bus depot together.
And he, by and large, gave an account which corroborated what Joe had said, that the both of them had been in the depot that morning, that they were putting up posters on buses, and that they had gone back to Viacom, arriving back at about 11:50 a.m.
But it soon emerged that Derek Kearney's statement had been given without the full facts at his disposal.
I think, in fairness to Derek Kearney, that when he made his initial statement and gave an initial alibi for Joe, he wasn't actually aware that Rachel O'Reilly had been murdered.
And as Gardaí began to piece together the events surrounding the murder, it began to become less and less likely that it was an act of random violence or the work of a disturbed burglar, as was being suggested.
The house was in kind of some sort of disarray, a bit of a look at that there'd been a break-in, or obviously the first thoughts were that Rachel had surprised a burglar.
More importantly, Gardaí now knew, through emails they had seen on Joe's computer, more about the level of discontent within his marriage.
Joe's phone was taken possession of a couple of days later, as was a search was carried out in his office in Bluebell Industrial Estate at the Viacom office, and his laptop was taken possession of on that occasion as well.
They had also more information about Joe's relationship with Nikki Pelly. Both he and she had played it down, but Gardaí were learning that rather than being the casual friendship which they both claimed, it was a full-on affair.
He had maintained to the guards that this wasn't a serious relationship, that this was a fling that had ended. So, I don't know. This was kind of the house of cards just started to really fall apart then.
But it was Joe's erratic behaviour in the days following the burial of his wife that really set off alarm bells with family, friends and investigators.
Apparently at the funeral, the police said to him that he could go back to the house the next day, that they were finished with it, and the detectives, and they gave him back the keys, and he was to see what was taken and let them know what he thought was missing and that.
And he indicated that there was a camcorder missing. He indicated that some of Rachel's jewellery was missing, and he indicated that 2 towels were missing from the house. And it was a peculiar statement to make, because if coming from a male, certainly I can talk for myself, and I think I can talk for the vast majority of males, that they wouldn't know how many towels was in the house, but he said there was 2 towels missing. He contacted his mother-in-law and father-in-law, Rose and Jim Calloway. He told them he had the house back, that it wasn't yet cleaned, and asked them if they would like to come over, and he'd show them the house. He'd show them exactly where she was murdered, and he would indicate to them what he thought happened. They were taken into the house by Joe, taken to the bedroom where the murder occurred, and in the bedroom, Joe reenacted what he thought happened to Rachel.
He went through the whole murder, what the way the murderer would have struck her.
And he got down on his knees and he reenacted a scenario where she was being held down on the ground and was being pummeled by her murderer with the murder weapon down on top of her head on a number of occasions.
And pointed to the blood, and that's why it's splattered and all this. Like, it was just bizarre.
He then indicated that he would suspect that the murderer at that stage left the room, crossed the hall and went into the bathroom to wash. But that having gone into the bathroom, the murderer, he felt, heard gurgling from the bedroom and returned because he wasn't happy that Rachel was actually dead, and hit her on a few more occasions before he left the house.
I could hear Rachel saying in my head, "Ma'am, he done it. It was him." And the more I looked at him, I just felt to myself, he did do it.
People were calling on him to offer condolences, to ask him if he needed any help, to offer to mind the children. And again, several of them spoke about how he would offer to bring them on what were later called the murder tours.
They were absolutely stunned. They couldn't believe what they were listening to. They couldn't believe what they were seeing.
And this is supposed to be a man who's mourning the loss of his wife, his beautiful wife, his wife of 7 years. Yet at the same time, he is demonstrating this, reenacting this to her devastated parents. I think it shows how cold, calculating and calm the man was. And I think it shows you the arrogance of the man.
In the days and months which followed, as Gardaí tried to put together the real facts behind the savage attack on Rachel, what changed the game was technology.
His phone was examined, and that was very revealing.
Using Joe O'Reilly's mobile phone records and CCTV footage they collated, Gardaí began to accurately recreate a profile of his movements on the morning of October the 4th, and what they discovered was radically different to the story he was telling them. And the results were damning.
The mobile phone evidence was crucial in terms of signal, in terms of when he sent a message to Rachel, in terms of when his co-colleague at work got in contact with him. It all fitted, and the mobile phone evidence, along with the CCTV footage, his bizarre behaviour, it all fitted in painting a very good picture. Circumstantial, but extremely strong.
The details about the early part of the morning of October 4th were true. O'Reilly had left the house early, heading to the gym and stopping for petrol. What he omitted to tell Gardaí was that he'd spoken to Nikki Pelly at length that morning.
Between the time he left his home and the time of the murder, he had been on the phone to Nikki Pelly a number of times.
There were 2 lengthy phone calls in the morning. One at like before 7, I think, for about 27 minutes, and another for about 25 minutes.
Gardaí could confirm that he'd left the office at 8:07, but instead of heading to Broadstone, as he'd suggested, he'd headed north in the direction of his home. Another call from Nikki Pelly, this time at 8:12, had routed through a cellular mast at Chapel Izard.
We discovered that, in fact, that phone, his mobile, was in the vicinity of the house that morning at around 9 o'clock, when he said he wasn't next or near the house since 5:30 a.m. when he left.
CCTV then showed Joe O'Reilly's car at a number of locations.
Joe drove quite an unusual car, the Fiat Estate car. It was large and navy, not a whole lot of them in the country.
A blue Fiat Maria car was identified at a number of locations, from leaving Bluebell Industrial Estate that morning, right through along the M1, out by Lusk, out by Murphy's Quarry, and towards Joe O'Reilly's house.
At 9:25, a call to Joe's mobile routed through the cellular mast at Murphy's Quarry.
You can see Rachel Riley's house from this quarry, and there was a mast there. So his phone pinged off that mast. That would be the nearest mast to the scene.
He received another call from a friend at 9:52.
The friend's phone pinged off a mast in Dublin, where he was ringing from, beside where he was ringing from, while Joe's phone again on that occasion at 9:52 a.m. pinged off Murphy's Quarry, the mast in Murphy's Quarry, which was 400 metres from his home.
Meanwhile, Rachel O'Reilly was seen on CCTV passing the quarry at 9:03. It caught her again on the way back home at 9:41. Gardaí believed she was murdered shortly after this. At 10:01, Joe O'Reilly was seen passing the quarry again, this time driving away from the direction of his house. Again, his phone records told their own story.
It set out the journey he took from there into the city and up to Broadstone. So he had never gone near Broadstone that morning.
Just before this, a message from his phone, believed by Gardaí to be an attempt to cover his tracks, routed through a mast located just north of Blake's Cross. When Joe O'Reilly eventually arrived at his office later on the morning of the murder with Derek Querney, a colleague noticed a change in his demeanour.
There was a girl there who saw them coming in, and she noticed straight away that Joe looked a bit flushed. And her initial reaction, this guy has been crying, and he's a bit flushed. And she made some remark to me, "Okay, Joe," and he said, "Grand." And she said, her comment was, "You look like shite." And Joe just said, "Oh, Jesus," and he fled down to his office.
Within hours, he'd be back home, to all intents and purposes, a grieving husband, mourning the murder of his wife.
He rang Rose, and he certainly wasn't in the habit of ringing Rose, but he rang Rose on that occasion to indicate that he couldn't get a reply from Rachel, and specifically asked Rose to go to the house. And history now shows he knew well what Rose was going to find when she got there to the house. He knew she was going to find Rachel murdered in the house.
But Gardaí were building a comprehensive and credible case against Rachel O'Reilly's killer. 30-year-old Rachel O'Reilly's brutal murder in North County Dublin on the morning of October the 4th, 2004 shocked the nation. But the high-profile Garda investigation which followed, what at first seemed like the work of a startled burglar, soon began to focus firmly on the victim's husband, Joe, a 32-year-old advertising executive. Despite his continuing protestations that he was in the Broadstone area from before 9 a.m, the records showed that his phone wasn't in that area until nearly 20 to 11.
He went into town fairly fast along the motorway, and that was the crucial piece of evidence that we got.
The Gardaí also went to great lengths to ensure that Joe's car was indeed the one that had appeared on the CCTV footage.
So they went and they tracked every single make and model of this car that was similar, and they interviewed all the owners and asked them where they were, and eliminated all the other make and models of the cars from that area. So they ended up with the only make and model of the car that was there had to be Joe's.
The 90 transmissions to and from the cellular system to his phone on the 4th of October, in the form of text messages and calls, had acted as a tracking device, pinpointing his movements all over the city.
When you're travelling in any part of the country, when you make a call or you receive a call, your phone bounces, that's the term that's used, it bounces off a mast which is in the vicinity.
O2, or the phone company, they got an engineer to examine all the masts between the city and Joe Riley's home, and they were reconfigured back the way they were on the morning of the murder, so that every reading they took was accurate, and that was fantastic evidence. That's what broke the case, really, to be honest.
When the media revealed that Joe, far from being the devoted husband he claimed, had in fact been having a relationship with Nikki Pelly, media and public interest intensified. Joe continued to maintain his innocence, bizarrely appealing on television to the killer to confess.
Why? Why, Rachel? Why then? What did she do, in your opinion, to deserve this? Are you going to do it again? If you are, you need help. What you've done is wrong. You've taken away a very young life for no good reason. I feel I know you because you had to kill her. You couldn't leave her alive to identify you. So it's a matter of time before you're found.
He had absolutely no hesitation talking to the media. I mean, that's the weirdest thing one of the weirdest things in this case. It's almost impossible to get people to talk to you in these kind of circumstances, but he almost revelled in it. He was accommodating. One of the more bizarre things was that he actually invited the media into the house and showed them where Rachel had been murdered. I mean, it's unheard of. In my entire career, I've never ever come across somebody behave that way.
And when Joe, accompanied by Rose, appeared on the Late Late Show, the interest reached fever pitch.
He was actually, seemed to be kind of enjoying it nearly. He was actually cracked jokes as well during it, which was just, in itself, just utterly bizarre. I mean, there's nothing funny about what they were on. They were appealing for information on the brutal killer of his wife, and yet he was making jokes about how, had he not proposed to her when he did, she would have thrown him off the top of the Eiffel Tower. It was just disrespectful almost.
Joe's behaviour as well was something that fascinated people. I mean, here was this man who was coming out on the Late Late Show looking for help finding her killer, and all the while he was the murderer. I suppose he didn't have horns, he didn't look like somebody that should have been a killer, and yet he had, in cold blood murdered his own wife.
The case became one of the most publicised and most talked about murder cases in the history of the state, regularly featuring in the tabloids. Despite the attention, however, Joe O'Reilly remained at large and uncharged.
He had himself convinced that he had committed the perfect murder, that he had left no stone unturned.
In November 2006, however, it was deemed there was enough evidence to charge Joe with the murder and send him to stand trial before a jury of his peers. The court date was set for June 2007.
The trial was almost a show, it was almost a play. It was of huge interest to the public and the media. There was queues outside the courtroom. every day, something we probably hadn't seen since Catherine Nevin's trial. And, you know, people battling to get in, to get a view of him, to have a little look at him, a little peek at him.
It was to be one of the most emotional and dramatic trials ever witnessed in Ireland, largely due to the nature of the evidence that seemed to be revealed on a daily basis.
As the trial went on, this picture emerged of a not-so-perfect marriage and of a very ambitious guy who was not so perfect. The story emerged of how he plotted to kill her and that he followed through with that. And a story emerged about how a guy nearly got away with murder.
O'Reilly was found guilty in 2007 by a jury at the Central Criminal Court of the murder of his wife at their home on October 4th, 2004. He was jailed for life.
He showed no emotion whatsoever, absolutely no emotion, but throughout the trial, you could very much read that he thought he was going to walk away, that there was no way he was going to be convicted.
O'Reilly later lost an appeal against his conviction, and in May 2015, the Court of Appeal refused his application to have his conviction declared a miscarriage of justice.
He has gone back to court on a number of occasions to try and prove that everybody was wrong and that, you know, he did nothing, he's totally innocent.
When the Court of Appeal delivered their judgment, O'Reilly looked like a man who had run out of road, like the last avenue open to him had just been closed.
In November 2016, the Supreme Court refused to permit a further appeal over his conviction.
That was dismissed. It was dismissed promptly. Wasn't even, it didn't proceed to full hearing. The Supreme Court dismissed it early. They refused him leave to even appeal. So that avenue was also shut off him.
The reality is, if recently he may have become eligible perhaps for parole, but because he has never confessed to Rachel's murder, because he has refused to come out and say that he is responsible, he's not eligible for parole. So the reality is he's shown no remorse. He has shown that he has never made a confession, and he's not sorry for what he's done. In fact, he's so stubborn, he's refusing to acknowledge it, he's refusing to admit it.
Joe O'Reilly remains in prison, his movements and that of Nikki Pelly still selling papers with the occasional report of their ongoing relationship. They have become minor celebrities in a macabre sort of way. Joe O'Reilly's manipulation of the facts and his continuing protestations of innocence can't take away from the fact that his cunning and deliberate plan to murder his wife was thwarted by technology and, to a huge degree, by his own stupidity.
He has no remorse for what he's done, and he is a very convincing liar because we can still see that both his partner and his family believe that he's innocent.
He is not one bit sorry for what he has done. He has never admitted responsibility for what he's done. He's not sorry, as far as I can tell. If he was really sorry, he'd just shut up and serve his time. But no, he has fought it absolutely every conceivable step of the way, and all the time prolonging the agony and the misery of Rachel's parents and her family. It's despicable, actually, what he's done.
There was nobody with her. When I saw her, she had such a death on her own out there, and we didn't even know.
Dreaming of many days gone by.
I hope he serves long enough to know what he done, and I hope he gets some sense of that when he closes his eyes or tries to close them at night. He knows the scene I saw, and he knows the scene he left. I haven't slept a night properly since that.
He committed one of Ireland's most shocking crimes, but he's paying the price.